Hello, everybody. Welcome to Sunday Morning Best Practices. We're going to have some fun tonight. I have to admit that all the Google searching I did for images for this webinar was quite a hoot. I love this opening pic. I couldn't tell if it was truly for a youth ministry or for an upcoming slasher movie. And I know sometimes doing youth ministry can feel like a horror show. You did what at summer camp? But I jest, really. This is going to be a lot of fun tonight. We're going to enjoy ourselves. So I'm Eric Bliss, the Pacific Western Region Youth Ministry Specialist. I come to you the culmination of 20 plus years of youth work as a high school teacher, soccer coach, youth advisor, et cetera, et cetera. Jonathan touched on the highlights. I hope you're excited to learn some new things because I'm amped to share what I've learned with you. What you have in front of you is the youth ministry vision for the Pacific Western region, which I will let you read for yourself. I don't have to read through all those. In a previous webinar, the first of this series, we covered a good chunk of this vision. And so if you're curious to learn more, you can email me or you can look at the archived webinar from the one that was in October, which was being present in an age of disconnect. I want to talk to you a little bit why I'm here. Unitarian Universalism has saved my life on 3 different occasions. Once as a youth, once as a young adult, and once in midlife. I'm not going to talk about all 3 scenarios, but I do want to talk to you a little bit about how Unitarian Universalism saved my life as a youth. I went to a new high school when I was 16 from a rural area to a more suburban area. And at this new high school, there was a lot of bullying, there was a lot of loneliness, there was isolation. As a result, I ended up in therapy. I had suicidal thoughts. And my parents had stepped away from Unitarian Universalism. But because of the struggles that I was having as a youth, they decided to invite me to go to the storefront church. It was in a little strip mall on Kingston Pike in Knoxville called Westside Unitarian Universalist Church. And the community, the support, the love, and the opportunities for leadership there really saved me. As kind of a tangent, I will say that when I bridged out, I ended up leaving Unitarian Universalism because I had no real sense of UU identity. And it's a real accident that I ended up coming back to Unitarian Universalism, and a happy one, right? Because it ended up saving my life 2 more times. So I tell you that story because there's a lot at stake here. We're talking about saving lives. We're talking about providing safe spaces, developing leaders, and a whole lot more. I want to talk now about the cross-regional collaboration that this webinar is kind of a part of. There are youth ministry competencies that exist on the web for your use, which I'll be referring to, and there's a resource page that has a link to them. We're collaborating with colleagues across the UA on webinar content, publicity, and development. There is a youth ministry laboratory that's happening in the Pacific Central District. That's a collaboration with the New England region. And then the UUA Youth Ministry Roundtable, which is a collaboration of all 5 regions of the UUA. So I kind of touched on the youth ministry or youth advisor competencies. There are 2 competencies covered in this webinar of the long list that are in the document. We're going to be covering tonight competency 4, which is supporting an inclusive youth ministry, and competency 5, the ability to bring thoughtful, skillful planning to leading, facilitating youth groups in a youth ministry context. So if you have a chalice handy, or if you have that wonderful Illuminations app, I invite you to light your chalice now as I say these words. We light our virtual chalices in celebration of the season, that in the coldest winter we may find warmth and support through gatherings such as this, and also discover profound inspiration in the form of new insights and ideas to fuel our passion for ministry and for religious exploration. May it always be so. So there's a book called Youth Ministry 3.0. It's written by Mark Ostreicher, who is a youth ministry expert from a different denomination. And this book is one that I would recommend simply for its big idea. It's not the most compelling read, I will admit, but the big idea that this book shares is quite a revelation. And that big idea is what Mark Ostreicher calls contextualization. He contends that Youth Ministry 2.0 was a focus in youth ministry on programming, finding programs to stimulate youth ministry in churches, congregations, communities. And he contends that that approach no longer works, that the programming approach, Youth Ministry 2.0, is out of date. And now we should be focusing on, again, what he would call contextualization, focusing on presence, being present for youth and giving the youth opportunities to be present for their faith rather than focusing on programming. So this webinar, as I mentioned, is the second in the series, although if you missed the first one, you're going to be just fine, focusing on presence, focusing on contextualization. Again, if you'd like to check out that first one, Being Present in an Age of Disconnect, it is archived and it's on the PWRUUA site. So I had my own ideas about the best way to run youth group. Remember, tonight we're focusing on Sunday morning best practices. And with my experience, I had my own ideas about that. Serving as a DRE for 6 years, working with my Laredo chapter, being a youth chaplain. But before I put this webinar together, I wanted to ask our colleagues and see what commonalities would blossom as a result of talking to folks who already had healthy youth programming. So I talked to 8 different religious professionals from across the nation. I talked to Megan Henry, the National Laredo Board Member for Professional Support in Brooklyn, New York. I talked to Rosine Beachy, Laredo Chair for PNWD, the Pacific Northwest District in Anchorage, Alaska. I talked to Liz Martin there with Grumpy Cat, the Chair-elect for MDD, Mountain Desert District, Laredo in Salt Lake City, Utah. Tracy Beck in Des Moines, Iowa. Huge congregation there, over 500 members. I talked to Kim Mason in my home church of Knoxville, Tennessee. Claudia Jimenez, former National Laredo Board Vice President in Vero Beach, Florida. Marcy Baudouin, the Pacific Southwest District Laredo Chair in Chandler, Arizona. And Reverend Leslie Mills, the minister at the Elgin, Illinois UU congregation. So we're talking about churches large, mid-sized, and small, ranging in span from 100 to over 500 members, both urban and suburban, high school youth groups with an average attendance of 4 to 30 each Sunday. And what I'm going to share with you tonight in this webinar is 10 themes that came out of these conversations. In other words, nearly all of these amazing congregations had these 10 criteria in common. Here and there were slight differences, but on the whole, the following criteria that we're going to look at were shared by each and every youth group. And it should be mentioned that 7 of the 8 congregations that I spoke to said their youth groups were growing, and the one outlier was holding steady. So as I mentioned, it can be fun Googling youth ministry. You get some pretty wild pictures like the one on this slide. We go from Horror Pick to Power Rangers in just a couple of clicks. These are the 10 criteria, though, that our colleagues' youth groups had in common. Integration, keep it current, a balance between youth and adult leadership, professionalizing youth ministry, inclusivity, multimedia, fun, food, connections, and faith. Let's get into it and look at each of these criteria individually. So the first one is integration. In other words, are the youth integrated into the life and work of the congregation? For example, In Anchorage, Alaska, you have youth on the board and on their environmental justice committee. Yeah, in Knoxville, Tennessee, youth on their RE committee. In Salt Lake City, Utah, youth in their choir, their adult choir, and also on their greeting team, their Sunday morning greeting team. So in your congregation, does an invitation exist for youth to participate outside of the youth room or group? And if not, what conversations can you start to ensure that this invitation begins, continues, or grows? Criteria 2, keep it current. Healthy youth groups are topical, agile, and flexible. What I mean by that is 6 of the 8 congregations I interviewed use no formal curriculum for their youth group. And one of the outliers, one of the 2 that didn't, often would set aside the curriculum they used to discuss, explore, and talk about hot button issues as they arose. The other 6 groups, as I mentioned, focus on what's hot today. And this is what Mark Ostreicher is talking about when he discusses contextualization. Are we being present to the issues that are facing society, that are facing our youth? Now, another thing I should hold up in terms of this topical approach is the congregations I interviewed have youth and adult teams which pick these hot button issues for exploration, or minimally have quarterly gatherings with the adults and youth to pick the subject matter that is of interest to the group, including the adults. Issues like gun violence, Black Lives Matter, ISIS, police brutality, the election, climate change, transgender issues, etc. So how can we explore these views through the lens of Unitarian Universalism? How can we have classes which are structured but are also able to switch gears when a noteworthy event arises? We'll be talking more about that a bit later. The third criteria I would hold up is balance. The youth ministry content and curriculum is a shared responsibility of the adults and the youth. In Des Moines, Iowa, there is a team of 6 youth that meet regularly with their youth coordinator to decide on the topics that they will explore. Indeed, the youth are more likely to buy in if they have a say in the enterprise that they are part of. Most, if not all, of the DREs I interviewed indicated that the youth had a strong voice in what happened in youth group. But not the only one, as we'll touch on later. And to clarify, if you've attended previous webinars, you know I'm big on class structure. Particularly the first webinar I put together, Youth Ministry, A Balanced Approach, also archived on the PWR site. So having set ritual elements and organized segments within your class framework will help your class to explore the topics that you select with your youth. Things like chalice lighting, check-in, a centering activity like we did today, spiritual practice, and closing can all be related to the hot topics that you and your youth select should you choose to go in this direction. Criteria 4, professionalize your youth ministry. 7 of the 8 congregations I interviewed had paid youth staff. Now, before we get a revolt, this doesn't mean that you, in your context, have to immediately start paying people. There can be steps to professionalizing, and indeed, I encourage you to take these steps and to move slowly so that as you gradually get more of a professional approach to your youth ministry and that atmosphere pervades the program, you'll have a greater opportunity and greater chance to instantiate some sort of paid or stipended individual. The steps that I recommend is 1, create job descriptions. What are the advisor's roles? What is your lead coordinator's roles? What is the DRE's role in youth ministry? Once you have your job descriptions, work with your youth to create mission and vision statements. Why does the youth group exist? What are the goals that the youth group has? What are some concrete goals? that the youth group has for the year, for the 4 years that the youth are a part of that youth group. Provide and or send folks to training. In PWR, we have all kinds of trainings. We've got youth advisor trainings, chaplain trainings, et cetera, et cetera. Ensure best practices and accountability by setting high standards for your youth program. I remember as a DRE, the pressure to find volunteers to work in our RE programs. And sometimes we look for that warm body. I think there's too much at stake for a warm body working with our children and youth. High standards. Once you begin those first few steps and you get some money, you can include stipends for special projects rather than paying by the hour. You could include mileage reimbursement for travel, field trips, and other things. You can add paid hours for the DRE who maybe works directly with the youth in some capacity, or expanding the hours of the DRE. Then, again, we're moving incrementally here. Look into hiring those paid staff people. You've got your job descriptions. You can make a compelling case once you professionalize your program for getting those staff. And your case is simple. We're talking about the future of our movement. These youth need to stay in Unitarian Universalism if we're going to be a vibrant faith of tomorrow, if we're going to have an impact. And so that's an important thing. Having professional practices in your program also promotes volunteerism. So that's another selling point. And finally, youth are the most sophisticated individuals who participate in our RE programs. And so because they're more sophisticated, they require more resources. This is why we have, and it's really necessary to have paid staff. And I'll tell you, it took 3 years for Tracy Beck in Des Moines to get her paid youth coordinator. It took me 4 years at First Unitarian Denver, going through these steps, professionalizing the position, and then making that compelling case to the board and finance council. Criteria 5, inclusivity. So this is a big section of tonight's webinar. I'm committed to the justice that happens not only outside our congregation, but also inside our congregation. And so how we approach our youth ministry can really set and model what we want our movement and our congregation really to be about and to live out in the world. So we're going to talk about a couple of different kind of lenses or aspects of inclusivity, from inter and multicultural all the way down to our blessed introverts. So one way we can be more inclusive is by being interculturally aware and supportive. In 2013, I attended a multicultural workshop led by UUA staff Janice Marie Johnson. It blew my mind and opened my eyes to the monoculture that can exist in UU congregations. In her workshop, she posed questions like, what's on your walls? Who are you talking about in your conversations, your liturgy, your content? What music are you playing, and how is that music couched or introduced? What videos are you watching and why? What pictures are being posted and who's in them? What message are you sending the world about your congregation, about your youth group? Are you conscientious with your language? And who are you reaching out to? Simple reframes and a dose of forward thinking can go a long way in making our youth spaces and indeed our congregations more immediately inclusive. And yet we still have much more work to do. In my interviews with the 8 congregations preparing for this webinar, it became more and more apparent that there's a large contingent of GLB and especially trans youth coming to our youth groups for spiritual guidance and support, or they're already present and are in discernment. We are called as UUs to be ready for these young souls and to have resources which will assist them on their journey as they explore our faith. One question I have is, Are you aware of and using appropriate gender pronouns in your youth group? Are they on your name tags? Have you heard of the genderbread person? We'll be looking at that image in just a moment. And did you know that there's a trans youth channel whose CEO is a former Young Religious Unitarian Universalist, YRU alum from the Mountain Desert District? That trans youth channel is in our resources page. What language are your youth using in group? Sadly, words like gay, homo, and fag, I hate saying that, are still commonplace in youth culture. Has your youth discussed this issue? Could it be the topic of a future gathering? First Unitarian Denver, where I served, has a youth that is currently transitioning. Ability. Access is huge. Last year, I led a chaplain training, and during the training in Lafayette, Colorado, I noticed that our meeting space had areas, particularly the dais, that were not handicapped accessible. Pointing this out to our participants during a section on marginalization, it was like watching a lightning bolt strike their brain. They hadn't even considered the layout or build of the space as being oppressive. For our fall con in Mountain Desert District, we had the young man Spencer, who is pictured above, who happened at this con to be elected to our youth adult committee. We are careful to ensure that the youth bus had access and space for Spencer's wheelchair, and we made sure that the space itself had similar accommodations. So some key points around supporting youth around ability. Ask, don't assume. If the youth are going outdoors or camping or attending any event, are all of the youth able to participate fully? And what conversations are you having in youth group to ensure that if a differently abled visitor attends, that you'll be ready to ensure their full participation? Gender. I've been blessed to facilitate a ton of youth events from sea to shining sea. And every time I ask a question in training at a retreat, a camp, a con, or otherwise, who is the first person to speak up, the first to raise their hand and speak out? Almost inevitably, it's a male identified individual. So some ways to support your youth group in regards to gender is to pay attention to those dynamics. Are males dominating the discussion in your groups? Male identified individuals dominating the discussion in your groups? Are they typically speaking first? If so, it sounds like it's time for a conversation. And also, what kinds of opportunities for non-identified males are there in your youth group and in church leadership? Is it a wider congregational issue? Or can the youth play a role in bringing this issue to the church? This image, the genderbread person, is one that I mentioned earlier. It's a wonderful diagram, and I highly recommend it if you haven't shown it to your youth and used it as the subject matter for a class or lesson. It's absolutely terrific. Socioeconomics. Not every UU is upper middle class. We are an upper middle class movement, but the demographics in our congregations and in our pews and in our youth rooms are changing. Some ways you can support your youth around this issue is don't assume folks have internet at home. That is a common mistaken assumption. If your youth, for example, are going to a coffee shop on a field trip or a luncheon, how can the volunteers and staff ensure that every youth is supported and able to fully participate while keeping confidentiality? It's a tough question, but one that we need to wrestle with. Language is everything. We've touched on that a bunch. Do your youth use words like ghetto or bum in reference to poverty? Has your group done fundraising for scholarships to wider UU offerings? And what kinds of conversations are happening in youth group that might indicate microaggressions towards individuals with fewer financial resources? So a quick story. While I was on walkabout, before I had come back to the fold in my late 20s, I was living in Salt Lake City. I was single, but I had been courting a young woman who was Mormon, and I was telling her about my experiences in Unitarian Universalism. And she was interested in exploring the U Church around the corner. So we went. And within the first 20 minutes of sitting in the pews, the Mormon faith was bashed 5 times in that 20 minutes. We were holding hands, and with each kind of insult, the hand squeeze got harder and harder until I felt like my hand was about to break. And so I turned to the young woman and said, "Would you like to leave?" And she said, "Yes, please." So sometimes we are not the most inclusive when it comes to belief and to faith. And it really starts at the top. I can say over the years, I am seeing change in that, and that's wonderful. But even in some of the youth groups I visit, there's Christian bashing or believer bashing that still happens. And I think it's important, and one way to support this is to make sure that your youth covenant addresses these and other macro and microaggressions. We youths often get accused of being insular and or navel-gazing. So how might our religious professionals engage our group, our youth group, to connect with one another and with other faith institutions to build empathy and relationships? So the last piece on inclusivity is our blessed introverts. This is a group in our youth communities that often gets overlooked. And as such, many introverted youth tend to phase out or disappear over time if their specific needs aren't addressed. So what can we do in our classes, infrastructure, and practices which will support our introverts? Please put an idea or two in the chat box. What are some things we can do in our youth rooms and our youth classes and practices to support our introverts? Some ideas that I would hold up: make sure you have breakout groups for your introverts. So even in a youth group of 4 to 6, break into pair shares and triads. Quiet reflection as a portion of each topic and conversation gives the introverts time to process and to recharge as a result of what might be very stressful conversation with, a group of 4 or 6 that to many may not feel like a large group, but to an introvert may feel huge. All right, back to our criteria and moving right along. Criteria 6 is multimedia. Technology, videos, apps, and other multimedia were mentioned by every single DRE I interviewed. Does your youth group have at least one tech component every time it meets? Are the youth invited to bring their own videos and media in advance for the topic or activity of the day? 2 specific approaches, and these are the 2 congregations that had curriculum that they followed, actually incorporated intentionally technology into the curriculum. One is a philosophical and spiritual curriculum called What's the Big Idea?, which incorporates video clips. That's being used in Vero Beach, Florida. The other one engaged 30 Days, which is Morgan Spurlock, who did Super Size Me. It's a show that he produced, and they used that show, 30 Days, and then processed those different episodes at the church in Chandler, Arizona. So a couple of specific apps that I think are powerfully useful in youth group I want to hold up. First, let's use Poll Everywhere. It's a free text-to-screen site. It's wonderful for discussion, for worship, spiritual practice, etc. You want to give it a try? Let's give it a try together. So what questions, let's see, do you have based upon the criteria that we've gone through so far? What questions do you have based on professionalizing, based on integration, based on inclusivity, technology, etc.? So to use the Poll Everywhere app, text Eric Bliss 862, and it doesn't have to be capitalized, to the phone number 37607. Another great app is the Remind app. It's free, and it allows for texting groups within your organization. So you can have groups for your youth, for your families, for your teachers, for your volunteers, for staff, and these can all be separate. And it's a great way to connect with these groups and send them blurbs, updates, things that are happening, trainings that are around the bend, a webinar like this for your youth advisors, and so on. You can send content to the group, hype up a Sunday session, advertise upcoming gatherings, or provide continuity for those who may have missed. It's a wonderful app, and I highly recommend it. There's a similar app called GroupMe that is also good but doesn't have as much functionality. Another app that's really popular right now amongst 18 to 34-year-olds, according to my research, is Snapchat. This is a photo editing, which includes adding text and drawings to photos, and brief video sharing and communication app. So say, for example, you're exploring the concept of divinity on a Sunday morning. You can have the youth answer quick prompts, what is divine to you, for example, and share their answers with one another using this Snapchat app. It's lovely and also free. So bouncing from technology, we're now moving to the 7th criteria, which is fun. Another recurring theme from all my interviews was that fun was a focus of youth group. For example, once a month in Salt Lake City, Utah, they have Coffee Shop Sunday. So the youth meet at a coffee shop, they play card games and do meditative drawing. It's key and it's important that you incorporate some fun, a game, or some kinesthetic aspect every Sunday. One type of game that I strongly recommend with your youth group is regular team building. How often do you incorporate team building activities into your youth group? Often at First Unitarian, when I was Jerry, we do them at the beginning of the year and then wouldn't do them the rest of the year. And then I realized that didn't make much sense because we have youth who are showing up throughout the year and trying to plug in. So having ice-breaking and team-building activities are key and need to be repeated throughout your yearly cycle. And remember that these youth, if you're lucky, are meeting for 1 hour once a week. And so getting them connected, getting them warming back up from a week spent in school can be quite positive. Ultimately, I recommend a team building activity at least once per quarter. And if you need ideas around team building, ask me, shoot me an email. I've got a ton of these activities that I'd be happy to share with you. Criteria 8, food. The way to their hearts is through their stomach. The congregation in Chandler, Arizona had a relationship with the nearby Dunkin' Donuts. And this location provided donuts and coffee every Sunday for their youth group. Now, personally, I recommend healthier snacks if possible, but food is a major draw on Sunday. I remember talking with one of my youth who was attending regularly, and I said, what is it you love most about youth group? He said, popcorn. and you know, it kind of broke my heart, but the reality was this youth attended every Sunday. And so if I got to use popcorn to get this youth into the youth group and to have them engaged, by all means. And it's funny, when talking to Marcy Bedouin, who's in Chandler, she asked the same question, and the donuts were the youth's answer as well. Ways that you can support this, ways to make it realistic and meaningful for you, is to ask congregants or different families to volunteer to provide a delicious offering once per week. Or you can have a very visible fundraiser with a portion of the proceeds going to your snack fund and a portion or more going to the local youth homeless shelter. Across the board, the most successful youth groups that I come across, and my interviewees were no exception, are ones who engage their youth in wider district, regional, and national events, making connections with the wider UU community. The Boston Heritage Trip happens with the Knoxville, Tennessee congregation, mission trips to New Orleans, the UU College of Social Justice's Activate trips to the border, which were formerly called Border Links, district cons, camps, and trainings. In PWR, we have chaplain trainings in Goldmine, which is a leadership school, general district or regional assemblies, All of these opportunities provide our youth with leadership development, learning experiences, and opportunities for cross-pollination with other youth that often have lifelong, lasting impacts upon their goals and worldview. If you're curious about when these things are happening, again, check out your district or regional website for these offerings. Another congregation I would hold up in relation to kind of these broader connection is Salt Lake City, Utah. They have a small congregation. They're only about 150 members, but they sent 13 youth to the General Assembly in Portland just this last summer, which is amazing. So how do your youth participate in the YRUU community? So a part of that kind of broader connection, I want to talk about interfaith connection too. There's a reason why Neighboring Faiths, which I believe now is called Building Bridges, is so popular with our youth. Opportunities to connect with other faiths and see how they worship and engage with their communities, with social justice, with the divine, are really life-altering. And I can tell you that with the congregations that I interviewed for this webinar, Brooklyn, New York is engaged in multiple interfaith service projects currently. Knoxville, Tennessee has partnered with Planned Parenthood for advocacy and education, which isn't quite interfaith, but it certainly is a community partner. And Salt Lake City, Utah, I'm so proud of that congregation. Their youth partner with Calvary Baptist to feed homeless persons in their community. What interfaith potential partnerships are near you? Something to consider. Our last criteria is faith. I saved the best for last. And I have to admit that not a single group that I interviewed, not a single congregation of the 8 that I talked to from across the country participated in regular spiritual practice. Not one. Speaking of broken hearts, I mean, that really broke my heart. Because, going back to Mark Ostreicher and contextualization, that means meeting the youth where they are at. And where youth are at is a place of constant questioning and also of seeking safety. And so I would hold up 3 reasons why we must have spiritual practice every time our youth meet. 1, I would argue being UU is about being UU. It's not about specific sacraments necessarily. It's not about particular dress. It's not about an individual religious text. It's a way of being. And UUs, we are seekers. We are active practitioners. Sure, learning Judeo-Christian heritage and about other religions is a part of what can happen on Sunday morning, but it can't be the only thing. We must engage with practice to help the youth find solace and to give them that religious context. Second reason we must practice every time we meet, the youth need tools, spiritual skills to navigate an increasingly complex and trying world. When the youth leave the program at First Unitarian Denver, when I was a DRE, I wanted to make sure that they had a practice they could call their own. If a family member died, if they lost a job, if there was some other calamity, financial or otherwise, mortality, you name it, giving our youth tools to navigate those rigors. And we've got some examples to come. Third, as a religion, Unitarian Universalism is in our adolescence. What a coincidence. So are our youth. It's time as a movement that we engaged in religious ritual and practice to help us and help them figure out who we/they are. To help with that end, I would also like to hold up what we in the Mountain Desert District, and it's growing across the Pacific Western region, call the 5 jagged rocks of Unitarian Universalism. And we're going to touch on that in a minute. No more hemming and hawing. We can no longer be the whatever you want to believe church. So when we talk about faith, we want to also talk about youth actively engaged in worship. Remember what I was saying about Google searches? This came up. To me, it looks like Def Leppard is about to walk out and start rocking. Does anyone's Sunday service look like this? If so, I'm there. So all kidding aside, here's some ideas to help your youth group get engaged in worship. One, and some of you already mentioned this, worship planning. In Des Moines, Iowa, there's a youth on their celebrant worship planning team. Another idea, in Elgin, Illinois, they set aside reserved first row seats for their youth group on the Sundays where they're attending worship. What a great idea. What an amazing idea. And the youth want to participate in worship, right? Not just sit through it. So giving them opportunities to provide music, chalice lighting, lead a time for all ages, even the liturgy. This past spring, I partnered with a youth to lead a worship earlier, and it blew the congregation away. Other ways to actively engage them, have regular milestone services like coming of age, bridging, even OWL services are big draws. Obviously, youth-led worship. In Vero Beach, Florida, one of their youth is the AV leader. So incorporating technology into their worship is the responsibility of one of their youth. And I would add that if youth are going to attend your adult worship service or intergen service, it's key to set aside time immediately afterwards to discuss. In Elgin, Illinois, where they have those reserved front row seats, after every Sunday, they have an invitation by the minister to sit down and talk about what they thought about worship. How lovely. How are your youth participating in worship in your church? Take a moment and post that in the chat box. How are your youth participating in worship? What are the things that individuals in your program are doing to engage in worship with the larger congregation? Getting back to structure within the classroom, I talked a little bit about how these thriving youth communities most of them don't have a set curriculum, but I'm advocating for that, but having a regular structure in class so that the curriculum isn't standardized, but the class format is. For example, a chalice lighting every class. This is something that came up in every congregation I interviewed. Having closing words, having a check-in. When you're doing that check-in, one of the things that I found in my research talking to these congregations was that a focused short check-in, for example, like the Roses and Thorns that they do in Anchorage, Alaska, is best so that the front end of your youth group doesn't get bogged down in kind of individual stories, and you can dive into content. So a focused short check-in is really, really important. As I mentioned, the chalice lighting and closing, and again, a spiritual practice every class. And what I've found in my experience is the biggest hurdle to having the spiritual practice each Sunday or each time your youth group meets is not the youth. It's our volunteers. So I encourage you, my friends, my colleagues, religious professionals, train your advising teams, work with your youth coordinator so that there is comfort, so that this feels like something that is attainable by our adults, because our youth are there. They're ready for it. They're hungry. Again, talking a little bit more about spiritual practice, never skip it. Have one every class or youth group meeting. As I mentioned, it provides tools to deal with the rigors of living, tools that will ultimately bring them back to their youth communities. We don't want them coming back by accident like I did. We want them to have a spiritual home. So one way that I recommend, and there's many ways to approach this, is to break it up into mind practices, soul practices, and body practices. And at First Unitarian Denver, where I was the DRE, we would do a mind practice one Sunday in a class, and then a soul practice the next Sunday and a body practice the next. So we're really mixing it up. Examples of mind practices are things like imagery exercises, discussion, journaling, storytelling. Examples of soul practices, prayer. Yes, we use can pray. Meditation of all kinds, mindfulness meditation, walking meditation, silent meditation, guided meditative coloring, mantra, chanting, toning. These are all examples of soul practices. And then body practices. These are great for youth, getting them up and into their bodies and moving around. Kinesthetic learning through singing, dance, yoga, body prayer, mandalas, drumming. Set up a labyrinth in your youth space using blue painter's tape. So I mentioned the 5 jagged rocks. As I talk to non-UUs, I get one of 2 responses when I speak with them. One is, I've never heard of Unitarian Universalism. That sounds amazing. Or 2, aren't you the religion where you can believe whatever you want? And to the first responders, I say, great. Let me tell you more. And to the second, I say, no, we cannot believe whatever we want. But we do have 5 core beliefs that come from 7 collectively agreed upon principles, 6 religious sources, and over 1,000 years of religious heritage. So a quick aside about our 7 principles. They're absolutely great, and they are foundation. They're foundational for who we are as Unitarian Universalism, Unitarian Universalists. But I consider them our Old Testament. And the reason I would call them an Old Testament, they aren't belief statements. They are ethical statements, and they're impossible to remember when asked. In fact, I can only remember 4 at a given instant, and they're always different. The 5 jagged rocks are 5 core beliefs that I would argue of Unitarian Universalism. And these were developed by Reverend Nancy Bowen and Reverend Mike Moran, who are ministers in the Mountain Desert District of the Pacific Western region. Based that development on an essay by James Luther Adams, who was a minister in Chicago in the mid-20th century. And this essay was called The 5 Smooth Stones of Liberal Religion. The 5 jagged rocks are, there's a unity that makes us one. We are all connected. Second, all souls are sacred and worthy. The first principle, inherent worth and dignity. Third, salvation in this life. No one knows what comes next. We can't prove whether there's an afterlife or not. And so we focus on making this world, this life, as good, as great, as just for as many people as possible. 4, courageous love transforms the world. We stand on the side of love when issues of injustice arise. And finally, truth continues to be revealed to us. Revelation is unfolding. Science tells us this. The more we learn, the more we know. This, my friends, I would argue, is our UU theology. I invite you to share it widely, and particularly with your youth group for discussion, exploration, debate. What's interesting is in the Pacific Northwest District of the Pacific Western region, our fall con, their focus was the 5 jagged rocks, which made my month. So here we are. We're at the end. Thank you so much for bearing with me and listening to me rattle on. A quick comment about, again, this Google search pick. Looks like the end of an ABC Family special, Google search. Anything that you would add to our list? Anything that you would add to the 10 criteria, these 10 threads that I saw kind of woven in between all these interviews with these folks who had thriving, successful, vibrant, growing youth programs? Some closing words. May your youth find peace, inspiration, justice, compassion, and a future in Unitarian Universalism, so that our faith can be continued and can continue to save lives and heal the hurting. Blessed be